good morning, hello, and welcome to our first series, episode 2 of 5 of the Humber and North Yorkshire Advanced Health Professionals Faculty podcast. My name is James, and in this podcast we will be exploring allied health professionals in advanced clinical practice and how our roles fulfil the 4 pillars of advanced practice. I have 2 colleagues with me today, so perhaps I can just pass you over.
I'm Jess. I'm a speech and language therapist by profession, and I've been in an ACP role for the last 12 months as a trainee, and I start my master's course this week.
Morning, I'm Claire Marsh and I'm an advanced paramedic in urgent care for the ambulance service, but also an advanced clinical practitioner, qualified 5 years ago nearly, and been in the ambulance sector since 2009.
Thank you very much both. And my name is James Lyle and I'm an advanced clinical practitioner in general practice and a non-medical partner at the HNY Group. So perhaps we could talk first about leadership in healthcare and what led us into working in advanced practice. Maybe Claire, you could start us off.
Yeah, so when I first started in the ambulance service, there weren't that many progression routes. This has obviously become more established, and at the time when the advanced clinical practitioner role started to come to fruition, that was at the point when I wanted to explore and progress further, ultimately wanting to enhance my clinical skills and be able to provide patients with a full holistic sort of perspective and be able to manage them to a more advanced level of practice, which is why I then went into primary care to become a trainee advanced clinical practitioner.
Fabulous. So you've been qualified now for 4 years?
4 years, yep, just over 4 years.
Fabulous. And then at the other side of the training journey?
Yeah, so the post became available 12 months ago. So I work in the areas of learning disabilities, which had recently had its multi-framework published. So we've got the specific framework. So it was a role that was developed instead of a matron to cover community learning disability services. And very similar to Claire, as a speech and language therapist, progression routes for AHPs, particularly in very small fields of practice like learning disabilities, were quite narrow. But this allowed me to have some senior clinical leaderships as well as maintaining senior and advanced clinical practice. So part of my role is supporting complex cases, supporting the services I work with.
Thank you very much. So just talking about myself, qualified for 4 years as an advanced clinical practitioner, was initially kind of fell into advanced practice, was working in rehabilitation in the community and stroke rehabilitation, and the advanced clinical practitioner role was suggested, which I went for, and realised very quickly, certainly for the course that I was on, it was quite a primary care based course. So I felt the need to switch role, joined Claire actually at HNY. We were both young trainees at HNY Group and very quickly realised, primary care, this is exactly what I want to do, this is exactly where I want to work, and the role simply developed from there. So for you, Claire, talking about the 4 pillars, how do you feel that your role meets those 4 pillars?
Yes, I think it's really imperative to ensure that anyone that's working as an advanced clinical practitioner is able to meet and evidence each of the 4 pillars. Now, obviously, I was working full-time in primary care as a trainee ACP and then obviously qualified as an ACP. My role now as an advanced paramedic became available, and it just felt like it was the right move for me to be able to not only pull all of the pieces of the jigsaw back together to my original professional background as a paramedic, but also be able to fulfill the 4 pillars within that role as well. Now, I still work in primary care, which enables me to continue my skills as an ACP and meet the clinical pillar. But the advanced paramedic role from a sort of clinical leadership perspective allows me to lead, also oversee specialist and advanced practice from a governance and audit perspective. I'm able to look into research proposals whilst also educating staff members around the wider workforce as well. So it's a really varied role, but ultimately maintains the 4 pillars of advanced practice.
And again, looking at yourself from starting your training journey, looking at the 4 pillars, but also in a very niche area, how do you feel that your role meets the 4 pillars?
I think the leadership and advanced clinical practice feels quite well established already, because I think that's the part of the role without the master's programme that have kind of developed over the last 12 months. So I oversee 3 community teams as the senior clinical oversight, and I have a small caseload of really complex patients, or like I say, I work with teams to navigate complex patients through complex systems. I think in terms of research pillar, governance and audit is part of that now, but I think within learning disabilities, research is quite unknown area anyway. There's not a wealth of research into learning disabilities and speech therapy within learning disabilities. So hopefully the master's programme, I think, can embed particularly that pillar a lot more in learning disabilities and then broaden that into thinking about education. I think my role now supports teams to think about what workforce planning do we need and what education do we need to keep growing within learning disability services. But I think the course should embed those 2 pillars a little bit more.
And I suppose from your point of view as well, being able to look at audits to be able to sort of underpin any learning and needs or within the wider workforce will come into your role as well.
Yeah, and that's it, where we are in the early stages around training needs analysis and thinking, what do staff want to develop, but what do we need as learning disability services change and progress, as our clients become more physically complex, as advances in acute and primary care medicine progress, our clients are living much, much longer than they would historically.
Sure. So I think we can all agree that when we're looking at the clinical practice pillar, certainly everything that we've talked about this morning relates very much to demonstrating a critical understanding and broadening our levels of responsibility and autonomy, whilst thinking about the limitations of our own practice, and which includes working with, very complex cases and being aware of risk. I think for myself in clinical practice, in general practice, and being a partner, the clinical practice pillar has very much evolved organically, and we'll talk about a little bit about governance and how this development needs a bit more strategic direction, and I think around the table we can all agree with that. But in terms of clinical practice in primary care, looking at triage, looking at your daily clinics, we haven't mentioned prescribing yet, but I think prescribing is a very big one for clinical practice, because I do feel sometimes in terms of identity, and again we'll talk about that in a little bit, we are sometimes seen as clinicians who can prescribe. In terms of leadership and management, we've talked about new practice and we've talked about service redevelopment in various services that allied health professionals work in. And I think in terms of the 4 pillars, we are very much leaders in service development, redesign, but also expanding our spheres of influence within the healthcare space. And I think this is what advanced practice can do for allied health professional. It gives us that vessel and that opportunity to do that without necessarily going down a traditional management route. We're all clinicians around this table, and that is very much our focus and our first love, treating patients. And I do think that advanced practice allows us to expand that sphere within a space that we want to work in. So, professional development how do you keep yourself informed in terms of progressing your practice and CPD? Do you want to talk about that, Claire, first?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can continue our professional development in so many different ways and different platforms now, such as podcasts. I think there's so many different podcasts out there that enables us to, hear about the new advances in healthcare and medicine, and also more of a strategic overview of what's happening in the wider healthcare setting. There's journal articles that I generally like to keep up to date with, and also review for the Journal of Paramedic Practice, as well as having staff that are going on the university route who are being educated to up to date evidence and evidence-based practice. So again, that keeps me up to date and keeps me on my toes a little bit.
And again, from a training perspective and also in a niche area.
I think we're really lucky in advanced practice that there is the funding and there is the routes through the apprenticeship masters within universities, and universities that are specialising in very particular frameworks to make sure those courses are tailored to people's needs is really positive, and that gives us hopefully longevity as a professional, and some building blocks to then look at the regulations and the governance that I know we all want to talk about a little bit later. And I think it is then those things like Claire said around keeping up to date with new evidence-based practice. How does that up-to-date NICE guidance, how does that then translate into clinical practice and clinical practice of our teams?
And do you feel that you have a CPD vision for your service moving forwards once you complete your training, and then how that transcends to other trainees coming through?
I think we do. I think there's a lot of support for the role to be really successful. So it's the first one in our learning disability service. I think some of it is navigating being an ACP and a speech therapist and thinking how does evidence for both become evidence for each for the HCP standards for being a speech therapist, as well as keeping your professional portfolio for advanced clinical practice as well, and evidence in those 4 pillars. I think there's a real risk we can miss one of the or 2 of those pillars.
So in terms of evidence for professional development, when you look at the literature, it's a slowly growing body of evidence regarding advanced practice, but it's still very much in its infancy as a novel profession. And CPD is very much focused in that literature, and there has been multiple questionnaires and reviews and evidence to suggest that CPD is often not built into the role. And I know, Claire, that's a frustration of yours. Within your role, you have the chance to scope that. Just talking about my personal journey a little bit with CPD, after qualification from university, CPD kind of fell off a little bit in a tangent, with the focus of the clinical pillar, seeing patients, and you kind of get lost a little bit sometimes, I think, when you first qualify. And there's definitely a gap there for CPD that is not being met. And then there's a wider topic of discussion about that with a primary care credential in advancing practice, but that's probably outside the scope of this podcast. But as a partner and identifying that gap, what we did locally at Haxby was that we introduced internal competency framework to support CPD need for the qualified ACPs, and we started to look at a career pathway from pre-trainee to post-qualified ACP and meeting that CPD need. So we have an extended learning event once a month, and then we go away with GP mentors and we look at what we've covered. It's very much skills based, but it is looking more about leadership and management as the service development project progresses, which has now become a regional offer. But for CPD, sometimes within the 4 pillars, research certainly, but education, I do think gets lost to patient need, because we are a very sought after profession. The health service needs our care, and we can sometimes, our time is so devoted to patients that we lose ourselves a little bit. And again, we will talk about identity, and I think that's part of that. But CPD is such an important part of being an ACP. And I think there's definitely opportunity there for us to extend allied health professional reach and scope within that space. Talking about patients, talking about patient-centred care, how do you feel your role is identified in respect to patient-centred care, and how you feel as an advanced clinical practitioner, but also as an allied health professional, that your role takes that one step further?
So I think from an ambulance service point of view, advanced practice was something that hadn't really been heard of. We had clinicians who were en routes to becoming, practitioners, but didn't have the underpinning governance and academic pathway in place. And this kind of evolved whilst I was working full-time in primary care. It became apparent, though, that this group of staff members needed, someone to oversee and be responsible for the governance and assurance of specialist and advanced practice, which is where the advanced paramedic role came into fruition.
I think in learning disabilities, we were really lucky that the service redesigned a senior clinical post to create an ACP post. And I think that's come from, particularly within the community services, our client needs have changed. So as I said earlier, we've got a lot more complex physical health, complex mental health and complex behaviour presentations within our client group. And the ACP allows for that structure for somebody that's clinically focused to give that support and oversight. And I think that's what you mentioned earlier, is we are all clinicians, and actually an ACP role really allows you to remain as a clinician. And as an AHP, sometimes I think historically we've become lost in having to take up management positions where this allows you to be really clinically focused. And in learning disabilities, that was felt really needed, which is a real positive, I think.
And do you feel you have the governance in your role to do that? Do you feel that you have the support in place to develop your practice safely within an advanced practice space as an allied health professional?
Yeah, I think I do. I think it's been set up that the master's apprenticeship route was attached to the post, which I think is really important, that it wasn't then going back to look at funding and time and commitments. That commitment was there from the post being released. I think probably what is a national difficulty is there is not many advanced clinical practitioners that are allied health professionals working in learning disability services, but I think over time that will emerge, and those networks will grow naturally just as more people take up that role, really.
Just coming back to what you were just talking about, patients are obviously living longer, but they come with more complex needs. Again, from an ambulance service point of view, our staff ultimately are trained to an enhanced clinical practice level, ultimately trying to manage patients more in the community where appropriate, but also identify those patients who may benefit from other referral pathways within their clinical assessments, and be able to try and ultimately aid the demand that's being had on all sectors of the healthcare setting at the moment. And I suppose my role as an advanced paramedic, ACP, or allied health professional is that the staff have the full support and guidance in order to become specialist practitioners and work at that higher risk level of making clinical decisions. Again, following on from the other 4 pillars, this allows us to oversee them, be able to govern and assure their clinical practice whilst also giving them the supervision in order to do so. But at the end of that is patient-centred focus, where the patients are receiving the best possible care at the right time, right place, right patient.
We talked about governance before we came into the podcast, and I think what you have both said there summarises just how important governance is for allied health professionals moving into the advanced practice space, and what you've mentioned there, Claire, about the governance supporting risk and holding clinical risk. Advanced practitioners in all sectors of healthcare. I can only talk about myself from a general practice perspective in primary care, but holding of clinical risk and being able to explore your clinical limitations safely to learn and develop is such an important aspect of the advanced practice role and being an allied health professional within this space. From a personal perspective, without overarching national guidance about governance, we have our 2017 framework, but we don't have a national body yet. And again, this is probably a podcast that is a separate conversation. But all the literature suggests that governance comes from the employer. And I think sitting around this table, we are the people that can shape that governance for qualified clinicians working currently, developing clinicians working in niche areas, to then inform national agenda so that our clinicians can safely work and that they feel well supported. Because governance isn't just about holding risk, it's about CPD, it's about research, it's about leadership, it's about clinical practice. Governance ties the four pillars together, and the insurance structures that underpin that are so very important. So I'm really pleased, Claire, and thank you for talking about that, because that is probably one of the biggest messages that we would like to talk about today is about governance for allied health professionals, and the focus of that for the opportunity to develop within advanced practice. We'll briefly talk about technology. Claire, perhaps you could just talk about technology within your role, because again, off air, you talked about a particular project of yours, which is quite close to you, which is just one of the, when we talk about opportunities in advanced practice, just how technology ties into that.
Yeah, and I'd like to say I'm not the biggest technology whiz going, but my role, again, it depends on the area that I work in, but in order to evidence research pillar, I'm undertaking a feasibility study initially with the hopes that it will expand to actual patients in the ambulance sector, but focusing on palliative symptom management with the use of virtual reality headsets. So it's early days, we haven't actually started doing this, but again, how advances in technology, particularly following COVID, I would say, technology in the healthcare setting has changed dramatically, but also allowing patients to get a better prospect of their healthcare as well. But again, advanced practice, there's sort of no limits really as to how technology can impact on that. And I know from a sort of overarching perspective in healthcare, there's a lot of talk on AI. And I'm not going to go any more into that because, again, I'm not the best at technology or claim to be in respect to that. But I think there's a lot in the future that is perhaps going to develop and hopefully help our roles as advanced practitioners and ultimately have that impact on patient care.
Thank you. So, talking about advanced practice for allied health professionals, what do you feel are the opportunities, but also the challenges and barriers in advanced practice for us?
I think opportunities, like I just mentioned then, I think compared to 10 years ago, the opportunities are vast, and I would say the world is our oyster really from an advanced practice perspective. There's a lot more roles and a lot more input that we can have into the wider healthcare setting, and ultimately enhancing patient expectations, and the services that are available to us. So I do think advanced practice has enabled us to open up more doors for progression, for clinical practice, and again, enabling all 4 pillars to be met.
I think it promotes the diversity of AHPs as well, and actually AHP's skill set and level of skill that sit within the AHP workforce. And I think the advanced clinical practice route allows that to be showcased a lot more. And I think we've touched on one of the barriers of being that kind of regulation, and that CPs are sat under their professional bodies. So for us, the HCPC, or for our nursing colleagues, the NMC, with nobody regulating the ACP pillars specifically. We are just regulated through our own profession and through our own professional standards. And that feels like something across even trainee ACPs, and the conversations that have been happening already with other colleagues on the master's programme feels like a really big conversation that needs to be addressed strategically.
So the focus of our opportunities is on the catalyst and the enablers of our role across the multidisciplinary team. In terms of opportunities for advanced practice, probably not just in general practice, but in the healthcare sector. For advanced practice, we know that the evidence base is in its novel infancy, but it's growing, and it shows that we are a clinically very high level profession, and we are also a safe profession. It is an emerging role. There is a clinician called James Pratt in Nottingham who's done a lot of work on governance, and he always talks about how the kind of governance plane is flying and it's being built as it flies, but it doesn't have a natural landing space at the moment. I think we're very much at that point. We're kind of almost approaching critical mass for taking the opportunity as far as we can possibly take it at this point. We know in the long-term plan that advanced practice, they are looking to push training places by 46%, so 6,000 trainees coming through by 2030. In terms of that number, we need to have the 4 pillars of practice very much institutionalized within organizations at place to ensure that they have the opportunity and the space to grow. Training is always going to be an important one. We've talked about that already today. The CPD space very much needs to be embedded into the training journey, not just at university, but with employers, but also a plan by employers after that. And that's very much what we found, myself personally, both as a clinician, but also as an employer, as a partner, that we need to provide clinicians that CPD offer and that safe space to work with a clear scope of practice, because we are semi-dependent practitioners. We also need to work hand in hand with our medical colleagues so that we are working in partnership and not in conflict. I think in terms of barriers, 2 quite pertinent to me is the identity of an advanced practitioner. And sitting around this room, we've all been asked, so are you a doctor? No, I'm not a doctor. I'm an advanced clinical practitioner. Oh, what's one of them? And then you have to go into the spiel of what you are. And at the end of it, the patient is still no clearer who you actually are. So there's a lot of work at all levels about advanced practice identity. And I think in terms of a barrier in respect to governance, as we've already mentioned, wherever you work, whether you're sitting in qualified or trainee, that is the vessel that as allied health professionals we can really push the opportunity of this role forward. As Claire's already mentioned, the advanced practice world is our oyster, and we do have the opportunity to grow exponentially, and we have government backing for that for the long-term plan, but it's just now seizing that opportunity. Well, thank you very much for listening to us today. Any closing remarks from yourselves?
I would say just as allied health professionals, like we've already spoken about, I do think we are imperative because we have such a varied professional background that we can bounce off each other, and we all have different strengths and weaknesses. But overall, as trainee or fully qualified ACPs, ultimately we do hold a very, very valued place within the wider NHS workforce. And like I said before, patients hopefully will be seeing the benefit of that now and in the future.
I think for me, it's that people on the cusp of thinking they want to go into advanced practice, particularly as allied health professions, is to really take that opportunity when it comes, because as we've all said, there is that knowledge, there is that skills amongst us as AHPs, and to really showcase that and to continue to make sure that we grow into the advanced practice space, and that we really, and across professions, to make sure there's representations in across professions. So if there's opportunities arise, to really as AHPs to put ourselves out there to pursue advanced clinical practice.
I agree, we are certainly the masters of our own destiny, working in collaboration across different roles, different levels of practice with our medical colleagues, with our advanced practice colleagues. There is a real opportunity for advanced practice within the next 5 years, and allied health professionals are critical and central to that, not only for the development of advancing practice, but as Claire has mentioned, for high quality care of our patients. And ultimately, patients are the most important thing. Thank you very much for listening today.